From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! We're on the road in Washington, D.C.
Most civilizations of the world, for most of human history, have seen the world in terms of relatedness and connection. And if there's one thing the rights of Mother Earth is waking us to, is we are all connected.
Today, in this Earth Day special, Vandana Shiva, the renowned Indian environmentalist, and Maude Barlow, the Canadian water rights activist. Then, Power Shift 2011. 10,000 young people gathered in Washington, D.C. Among those who spoke, former Green Job czar Van Jones.
The Pledge of Allegiance says liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice for all. And that's what your movement is about.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States has begun using armed predator drones to attack forces loyal to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Defense Secretary Robert Gates says President Obama has authorized the use of predator drones.
Now, the President has said that where we have some unique capabilities, he is willing to use those, and in fact, he has approved the use of armed predators. And I think that today may in fact have been their first mission. So I think that will give us some precision capability.
The U.S. has carried out drone strikes in at least 5 countries in recent years: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. Meanwhile, Admiral Mike Mullen, chair of the U.S. military's Joint Chiefs of Staff, admitted today the conflict in Libya is moving to a stalemate. Senator John McCain, one of the strongest congressional proponents of the U.S. military intervention, arrived in Libya earlier today to meet with rebel fighters. The Wall Street Journal reports senior U.S. and Iraqi military officials have been secretly negotiating a possible plan to keep about 10,000 U.S. troops in Iraq beyond the scheduled withdrawal of all U.S. forces at year's end. Iraqi officials, though, have expressed concern that a continued U.S. military presence could lead to protests similar to those sweeping other Arab countries. On Thursday, Iraqi officials imposed a curfew in the city of Mosul, where protesters have been staging a sit-in for the past 2 weeks. Protesters have been demanding the departure of U.S. troops and military bases and the release of political prisoners. Major protests are taking place in Syria today, just days after the Syrian government lifted the 48-year-old emergency laws. The protesters on the outskirts of Damascus have been chanting, quote, "The people want the downfall of the regime." In news from Bahrain, at least 32 doctors, including surgeons, physicians, pediatricians, and obstetricians, have reportedly been arrested and detained over the past month. Human rights groups say the arrests are part of a campaign of intimidation that runs directly counter to the Geneva Convention guaranteeing medical care to people wounded in conflict. The Independent of London reports one doctor, an intensive care specialist, was held after she was photographed weeping over a dead protester. Another was arrested while operating on a patient. In Pakistan, U.S. drones have killed 25 people in North Waziristan. The dead reportedly included 5 children and 4 women. The attack strike came 2 days after a visit to Islamabad by Admiral Mike Mullen. In other news from Pakistan, there's been a major development in the case of Maude Barlow, a Pakistani woman who spoke out publicly 9 years ago after she was gang raped. The rape had been ordered by a tribal council as punishment for a crime allegedly committed by her 12-year-old brother. At the time, Maude Barlow accused 14 men of being involved. In 2002, a court sentenced 6 of the men to death while acquitting the others, citing a lack of evidence. But on Thursday, the Pakistani Supreme Court overturned 5 of the 6 convictions. The death penalty for the 6th man was commuted to life in prison. On Thursday, Maude Barlow said she fears her life is now in danger. Haiti's president-elect, Michel Martelly, has called for Haiti to build a new army, a move that has been criticized by some human rights groups. Haiti disbanded its military in 1995. The Haitian military had long been known for its brutality and support for coups. Martelly made the announcement Thursday during a trip to Washington.
I think it's a must that we create a Haitian force. Whether you call it the military, the gendarmerie, it's irrelevant to me. It needs to be a modern army who will have a medical corps, an engineering corps, and we will be ready to intervene in case of whether it's chaos, whether it's catastrophe, the earthquake or hurricanes, to get involved in reforestation, preserve our forest, a modern army. We don't foresee Haiti going to war with any other country, so it won't be an army with heavy equipment like warships or fighter jets.
A group of prominent Israelis met Thursday in Tel Aviv to announce their support for the formation of an independent Palestinian state. 47 leading Israeli cultural figures and academics signed a declaration of independence from the occupation. Yaron Ezrahi is a professor of political science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
The subjugation of the Palestinian people by Israel is not only the elimination of Palestinian freedom, it also corrupts our freedom in the state of Israel.
A group of Israeli protesters tried to disrupt the event. They heckled the gathering and called the participants traitors. With gas prices above $4 in some states, President Obama's ordered a federal investigation to see if fraud or manipulation in oil markets is behind the spike in gas prices.
The Attorney General is putting together a team whose job it is to root out any cases of fraud or manipulation in the oil markets that might affect gas prices, and that includes the role of traders and speculators. We're going to make sure that nobody's taking advantage of American consumers for their own short-term gain.
Chesapeake Energy has suspended hydraulic fracturing or fracking at its natural gas wells in Pennsylvania after a large spill earlier this week. Thousands of gallons of toxic drilling fluid used in hydraulic fracturing spilled into a Pennsylvania waterway Tuesday night after a blowout at a natural gas well. In political news, embattled Republican Senator John Ensign of Nevada has announced he'll resign amidst an ongoing ethics investigation. And supporters of accused Army whistleblower Bradley Manning disrupted President Obama at a fundraiser in San Francisco Thursday. The protesters, who bought tickets to the $5,000 a plate fundraiser, began singing a song about the military's mistreatment of Manning. The singing was led by Oakland activist Naomi Pitcairn. Supporters of Bradley Manning disrupting President Obama at a fundraiser Thursday. Earlier this week, Bradley Manning was transferred from Quantico to a prison in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the world celebrates Earth Day, Bolivia is about to pass the world's first law that grants nature equal rights with humans. The Bolivian delegation to the United Nations urged the global body to adopt a similar law during this week's Harmony with Nature conference.
The United Nations is revolutionizing the way we look at our planet. At the moment, various issues are being reseeded in the United Nations, and we have begun to discuss the idea of declaring an official International Day of Mother Earth. And we will also soon be discussing what are the rights of Mother Earth.
That was the Bolivian foreign minister speaking in New York City about the Harmony with Nature dialogue at the United Nations. This week also marks the one-year anniversary of the BP oil spill. Next week, the 25th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. Radiation levels around the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan remain high. As these disasters multiply, Latin American countries such as Bolivia have taken the lead in adopting measures to protect the environment. Ecuador has also adopted a resolution protecting nature. We speak with two renowned environmental justice activists. Maude Barlow and Vandana Shiva. Maude Barlow is the head of the Council of Canadians, Canada's largest public advocacy organization. Barlow is also co-founder of the Blue Planet Project and chair of the board of Food and Water Watch. Vandana Shiva, world-renowned environmental leader, feminist, and thinker from India, is the author of many books, including Earth, Democracy, Justice, Sustainability, and Peace, and Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Development. I started our conversation by asking Vandana Shiva about the nuclear catastrophe in Japan and what it has meant for India, where major anti-nuclear protests have been sparked, in which one protester was killed. I asked her to explain what happened.
We have a very, very strong anti-nuclear movement in India, and the difference between the Indian movement and any other movement is it's not just about the stupidity of splitting the atom to boil water, which is what nuclear power ultimately is, creating huge amounts of radiation hazard in the process. But in India, it involves the typical violence of land grab. And one of the most fertile parts of India, in the Western Ghats, the Ratnagiri district, they're planning to set up the biggest ever nuclear power plant of the world, being built by a French company, Areva, violating every right of the people, including local democracy, where people have a right to decide what happens. All the local authorities have resigned, and the protests continue. And just 2 days ago, there was a killing when the police fired on peaceful protesters. So in India, the costs are even higher because the human costs join with the costs of nuclear hazard. And from 23rd to 26th, a march is being organized, and I'm part of the organizing group, from Tarapur, which is the oldest nuclear power plant of India, to Jaitapur, which is where this giant mega nuclear power park is being set up.
And people live there. They'll be displaced.
People live there. I mean, typical of such things. They claimed it was barren land and nobody was there. It's one of the most fertile. That's where this wonderful Alfonso mango comes from, this amazing giant-sized delicious mango. Good fisheries, amazing horticulture, and well-to-do people, because nature is abundant. It's the Western Ghats where the monsoon just pours the water, and coastal regions are usually just the more productive, more fertile. A similar protest is happening around a steel plant called POSCO, with a Korean plant, but it's not owned by the Koreans anymore. It's owned by Wall Street. It's owned by the financial institutions of this city who brought down the world's economy. And it was very interesting that Warren Buffett was in India about giving, you know, creating the art of giving. And he has huge shares in the steel plant, which will displace large numbers of people. And for 6 years, people have been saying, no, we will not give our land. And I think that's so important, that we need to realize that, first, we don't give rights to nature. Nature has rights. And more often than not, nature's rights and people's rights are allied as one in most places of the world, where in places like Jaitapur or places like the POSCO area, people are saying this land is our mother. This is not an esoteric idea. It's the most relevant, potent, democratic idea of our times.
I wanted to ask you about a man you probably would agree with on a number of issues, George Monbiot. We recently had on debating the issue of nuclear power. This is what he had to say.
Well, obviously what's happening in Fukushima concerns me a lot about the area surrounding Fukushima. It's a horrible, dangerous, extremely traumatic series of events that we are seeing there. But I'm very worried that the global response to what's happening in Fukushima will be to shut down nuclear power stations around the world and to cancel future nuclear power stations, and that what will happen is that they will be replaced by coal. Now, coal is hundreds of times more dangerous than nuclear power. Not just because of climate change, though of course climate change is the big one, but also because of industrial accidents and because of the impacts of pollution on local people. If we just look at industrial accidents alone, these massively outweigh both the fatalities and the injuries caused by any nuclear accident we've ever seen. In China alone, last year, 2,300 people were killed in industrial accidents to do with coal mining. Purely by coal mining accidents, 2,300 killed. That's 6 people a day. That means that in 1 week, the official death toll from coal in China is greater than the official death toll from Chernobyl in 25 years. And that's to say nothing of the hundreds of thousands of people contracting really unpleasant lung diseases which will cause them a very slow and painful and terrible death. So what I'm calling for here is not complacency. I think it's absolutely appropriate to be very concerned indeed about what's happening in Fukushima, but I'm calling for perspective, and I'm saying that we must not replace a bad technology with a much, much worse one, because unfortunately that is what's likely to happen.
So that was the well-known British columnist George Monbiot, who is in favor of nuclear power, says it's simply cleaner than coal. And if we're talking about climate change, which he is deeply concerned about, nuclear is the answer.
Well, what we really need is a coal-free and nuclear-free future, because the sun's energy is so abundant, and we've not even started to tap it in sensible ways. Alternative renewable energies, if only we would put the investments in that direction, would be affordable, would be decentralized. Nuclear must be a centralized system, and as we are witnessing in Jetapur with the protests, with the shootings and the killings, and the place turned into a total police state where nobody can gather, even the elected officials can't hold meetings, where democracy has to be sacrificed, that's not the kind of option we need for energy. And I think it's wrong of George Monbiot to rubbish the point of view of millions of people around the world, including governments, like the government of Germany said, we won't build any more nuclear power plants. China, which has put everything on hold. Now, these countries aren't crazy. They aren't a fringe. And I personally get disappointed when friends like George Monbiot think they are the wisest ones on this planet. And just because they have a column, they can switch everyone's way of thinking. There is an ancient recognition of the hazards of nuclear. I began my life in the nuclear industry of India. And it's when my sister woke me up to the damages. I wasn't ever taught radiation biology. We were just taught physics, fission physics. And I realized it was very partial knowledge.
You are a physicist.
Yes, and then I did theoretical physics. And eventually I did foundations of quantum theory. And what I love about the rights of Mother Earth is we are overcoming the separation between humans and nature that was built into the Cartesian thinking that nature's out there and we are out here, but also the kind of divisive separatedness that Cormac pointed out yesterday at the United Nations Conference on Harmony with Nature. He said, I began my life fighting apartheid, and apartheid means separateness. Separateness on the basis of color. I think separateness is the disease of the past. It's the dinosaur in the intellectual frame. Separateness was a very artificial imposition. Most civilizations of the world, for most of human history, have seen the world in terms of relatedness and connection. And if there's one thing the rights of Mother Earth is waking us to, is we are all connected. And it's in that connection we can't have arrogant solutions like nuclear is clean. Just because you don't see the radiation doesn't make it clean. Fukushima has become like Chernobyl, and that the Japanese government is recognizing.
And so, Maude Barlow, why are you here in New York at the United Nations on this Earth Day?
Well, there's been a debate this week, an interactive dialogue, it's called, at the United Nations on a resolution on harmony with nature that was introduced by the Bolivian ambassador to the UN, but was adopted by the General Assembly. So we're beginning the discussion and dialogue at the United Nations on the concept of the right to water. A number of us were in Cochabamba a year ago, this Mother Earth Day, when we finalized this draft of this Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. And so basically we're here to introduce it to the UN. The concept, we eventually want the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth to be a companion piece to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, we're not there yet, we understand that, but that's the goal, both within nation states at the United Nations and then just organizationally. We want people to adopt it and start talking about it. And we have a wonderful new book called The Rights of Nature, The Case for the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. So this is a beginning of a real process to have a larger dialogue on exactly what Vandana is saying.
What is the threat to water in the world today?
Well, the threat to water, well, so speaking about nuclear, is a wonderful example. It was interesting. and it's a perfect example of what we're talking about when we say that we have to recognize nature's rights, and Vandana's right. It's not giving, it's recognizing. It is a report I saw the other day on the fish, touched by the radiation contamination from the nuclear plant in Japan. It said, don't worry, by the time it gets to humans, it won't be harmful. And it was like, that's all that mattered. It's this human-centric notion that we're all that matters, that other species, that the planet doesn't matter. The biggest threat to water in our world is that humans, modern humans, quote, civilized humans, see water as a huge resource for our pleasure, profit, and convenience, and we do what we want with it. We dump whatever we want in it. We grow whatever we want, wherever we want. We move it wherever we want, and we are running out. There's a brand new report. It says by 2030, the demand in our world for water will outstrip supply by 40%. And I don't know if people can get their heads around how a horrific statistic that is and the suffering that that's going to cause. You can come at this as some, people are already joking, oh, you're talking about rights for ticks and rights for rats. That was, this is the right wing mocking what we're doing. We're talking about survival here. We're talking about human and other species survival on this planet. If we don't change the way we see the world, the way we see nature, the way we see water, it is not a big resource for us. It is the essential, these are the essential elements of a living ecosystem that gives us all life. And this is about survival.
Maude Barlow, head of the Council of Canadians, Canada's largest advocacy group, and Vandana Shiva, environmental leader from India, among her books Staying Alive, Women, Ecology and Development. We'll come back to this Earth Day conversation in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Washington, D.C. On this Earth Day, we rejoin our conversation with Vandana Shiva, the renowned scientist and environmentalist from India, and Maude Barlow. She's head of the Council of Canadians and, well, among her books, Blue Covenant, The Global Water Crisis and the Fight for the Right to Water. We saw you in Cochabamba last year when we were covering the conference, the gathering of tens of thousands of people around the rights of Mother Earth, Pachamama, as they said there. Why is Bolivia and Ecuador taking the lead here?
Well, partly because they have governments that actually represent a lot of the will of their people. I can't imagine what that feels like. We're going through an election in Canada, and we're just tearing our hair out because we're going to get a bad government again. So I think partly you've just got a government closer to the needs of the people. But the Andes are melting. I mean, we have a crisis. A brand new study last week from the Foundation of U.S. Scientists said that La Paz, which is the capital of Bolivia, is in great crisis with a terrible drought threatening the 2 million inhabitants because of climate crisis. And unless something dramatic changes in a very short period of time, they don't see any way around this. So it's affecting their food, it's affecting their access to water. So it's very immediate. When you have this kind of immediacy, I think people like the president of Bolivia, Morales, and his ambassador to the United Nations, Pablo Solon, just say, I don't care if you like me or not. I'm not particularly here for a popularity contest. I'm here because we're talking about life and death of the people where we live, and we need to get that urgency out there. And that was it was Bolivia that led the charge on getting the right to water recognized. And so similarly, very interesting that it would be the same government. It was Bolivia that said no to the so-called consensus that happened in Cancun, which was based on a market model for the so-called solution to climate. So,
and what's wrong with the market model?
The market, well, Vandana will have so much to say too, but basically, and the UN has just put a huge price tag on nature now. The whole answer, not just to climate crisis, but to the water crisis and the forest crisis, is to put a dollar figure on nature and bring nature into the market system, so that basically all of nature has to compete with other uses for it in order to survive. And it basically, it's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for the wealthy of the world and the powerful within countries, claiming, well, they're, so much more than others and so much more than nature.
Vandana Shiva, you've been taking on corporations in India and around the world, but talk about the corporatization of nature.
I think the consequences of the corporatization of nature is first and foremost that at a time where we should be recognizing the integrity of nature, the prior rights of nature, nature's generosity, the generosity of the earth to provide us life itself, we are going headlong into the path of hallucination, where we've assumed we are not just separate, but we're continuing the idea of mastery and conquest over nature, adding to the technological tools like the idea that we can control nature through nuclear power. Now we want to control nature through market mechanisms and commodification. Why is that wrong? Firstly, it's wrong because nature is too rich, too diverse. We know too little about it. So whatever price we'll put will be partial. It'll never catch the whole story. We've not even begun to find out the soil organisms that give us food. We don't know how different species hang together in a forest to create that amazing biodiversity of the forest. So it'll be linear, it'll just be carbon functions, when that's not the only function of a forest. And it'll definitely not take into account the integrity of species. I started Navdanya and saving seeds when I found out that corporations wanted to patent life. When life is not created by them, it is created sui generis. It is part of creation. But there's a second problem with the commodification of nature, and that is that it gives a new legitimacy to appropriate and alienate the resources that support people's lives, especially the resources of the poor. So what do we see with this new thinking of commodification of nature? We see the biggest land grab that Africa has ever seen, much worse than anything that happened during colonialism. In India, the land grab for mining, for nuclear power plants, for steel plants is literally becoming a war zone. There's a green hunt that's being implemented. Our dear, dear friend, Dr. Binayak Sen, someone like us, was thrown into jail for life imprisonment. Thank goodness the Supreme Court just a few days ago granted him bail, saying that if you carry literature on Marx, it doesn't make you an Naxalite, just as much as carrying Gandhi's biography doesn't make you a Gandhian.
Well, wait, stop for a second, because very few people follow the story, and Democracy Now's Anjali Kamat went and spent the weekend at the Sens, has been bringing us reports on Dr. Binayak Sen, but in a nutshell, explain his case and the significance of it.
Well, Dr. Binayak Sen, as I said, is a dear friend, a medical doctor who's worked to serve the tribals all his life. He was a gold medalist from one of the leading medical colleges of India, but decided instead to go to the villages. He and his wife Elena have worked with the tribals. I've worked with them to help set up community seed banks for seed conservation like we do in Navdanya. Binayak has been working to set up primary healthcare initiatives, and he was also the head of the People's Union of Civil Liberties. Now, the commodification and globalization of the resource grab has meant that this area where he worked, which is now called Chhattisgarh, a new state, is a very mineral-rich area. That's where the corporations are going for iron ore. That's where they're going for coal mining. And that means they're violating the rights of the tribals that are institutionalized now in our constitution. We have a Panchayati Raj extension to scheduled areas, which basically means the tribals decide what happens to their land. And when they started to decide, and I was at these public hearings in the early days, when in the 90s, when this law was passed, one after the other tribals would say, we don't want money, we want our land, we want our forest, we want our home, we want to live with Mother Earth. That's when the violence started. And I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't a global advising system going on. But now there are private militias in addition to 70,000 paramilitary troops that have been deployed in tribal areas in the name of controlling the Maoists, but really to flush out the tribals, create an empty land so the minerals can be grabbed. Binayak wrote a report for the People's Union for Civil Liberties, being the vice president, and said this militia was killing innocent tribals. It became the first report. That's what really got the government very angry with him, and they were targeting him for very long. Eventually, they arrested him, planted fake evidence like putting some letters into someone else's bag and saying they were handed over by Binayak. Long story, I won't go into details. But Binayak, who is a medical hero of India, he's a civil liberties hero of India, he is as good as you can live a life for the people, in service of the people, thrown into prison for life imprisonment. And that's why his case is so significant, because it's like in the Nazi time. You remember that poetry that the priest wrote? I wasn't a unionist, so I didn't speak, and I wasn't there. You know, and it's exactly like that. They've made a test case of Binayak to say, any of you who stand for the rights of Mother Earth, who stand for the rights of people to their resources, watch out. If we can do this to a Binayak, we can do it to you. And that's why I really believe we are at this watershed. We'll either go the democratic route, recognizing the rights of Mother Earth, living within the limits of the planet, living a good life with less wastage of resources, or we will go very fast into the path of fascism, militarization, and commodification of nature has to be a militarized commodification in today's time.
What does Earth democracy mean, Vandana Shiva?
For me, Earth democracy means, first, recognizing the fundamental fact that we are part of nature, that human rights and nature's rights are not separate, because we are just one strand in this amazing mystery and miracle that the Earth has created in terms of life. But Earth democracy also means democracy in the everyday life of people, exercised daily by ordinary people, not the once in a 5-year or 4-year election. Because everywhere around the world we are seeing, you can bring someone to power and they don't represent your will anymore. So democracy under corporate control has mutated from of the people, by the people, for the people, into of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. In this country, I have watched how Wisconsin suddenly became a playground for destruction of democracy and destruction of the fundamental rights of collective bargaining and public services and public domain, only because there is this corporate pressure on privatizing everything and preventing people from exercising their democratic rights. So it's the democratic rights of the people and the earth versus the fictitious corporate rights that corporations have assigned to themselves, and now they're costing the earth and people too much. They're bringing nothing in return. It used to be the case that when General Motors put out a car, it gave employment, it even gave salaries so people could buy that car. Today, the corporations give nothing back to society. They just take from nature, take from society, and want to rubbish this planet and rubbish our lives. And I think people are getting fed up. The entire rising in the Arabic world is part of that fed-upness.
It is also, Maude Barlow, the first anniversary of the BP oil disaster. You come from Canada. There was just a protest around fracking, around BP, around tar sands. Can you talk about what we should understand about where we are headed? In this year, offshore drilling, President Obama said it could resume. people in the United States hardly know what tar sands is, though we get much energy, oil, from Canada.
Well, at current rate of growth, the tar sands will become, in the quite soon foreseeable future, the worst site of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Enormous amounts of water is being destroyed. They've taken down a forest, this boreal forest the size of Greece, and there are children in the downstream First Nations communities with bile duct cancer at the age of 4. I mean, it is an absolute horror. And what Americans need to know is that it's coming to a community near you in the form of this dirty oil, the bitumen, actually being piped by pipeline over the Ogallala Aquifer to be refined in the Gulf, or there are other pipes now taking it, and more to be built to take it to the American side of the Great Lakes. It's corrosive, it's poison, and it will destroy the water systems if it leaks, which I promise it will. We also have gas fracking all over North America. This has become just an absolute obsession with people who know about the danger to water, because, of course, what you're required to do is put massive amounts of chemicals into the water and then steam blast it into the rock horizontally, to release the gas. And we're even seeing operations along the St. Lawrence River, and even the Quebec government has just given operations the okay to explore right within the St. Lawrence River. And that's not allowed on the American side, by the way. Usually we say, oh, it's worse on the U.S. side, but it's not in this case. It's worse on the Canadian side. I think the point here, to make the connection to the rights of nature, is that while our governments make noise about caring about the environment, and make on Earth Day we'll all make strong statements about this, all of their actions belie this. From trade agreements, which we continue massively to promote around the world, the bilaterals, there are close to 3,000 of them now, to these big new CETAs, they're called, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreements, which are not just national procurement, but subnational procurement. That's water systems and roads and mining operations and municipalities and schools. It's everything. It's the next level down, where corporations are going to actually be able to dictate the conditions under which local funding is how you spend your local money and on what values, and be able to stop fair trade bans and that kind of thing. All of that is galloping along, and this is so-called green economy, as it is seen by the powerful in our world, is basically no change, continued unlimited growth, continued unlimited free trade agreements, continued unregulated investment of the type that's taking place with the land grab in Africa, but with a green technology. So we'll just substitute that dirty old technology, which of course they're not, because the tar sands is the dirty old technology, and that's what they're building it on. So it's just language around caring for the earth. And what we're trying to say is that if we're really going to survive as a species, and if the planet is to survive in any condition as we understand it, we have to shift our thinking and stop thinking of ourselves as being above nature, and stop thinking of ourselves as having the rights that no other species has, or no other form of the earth has. We just have to change. What would the world look like if we could see it differently? Right now, for most environmentalists, the best we ever get is that we negotiate the amount of toxics being dumped into a particular system or in the tar sands. All we've ended up doing is having a series of reports which just tell us how bad it is, but we have not managed to stop one pipeline. We have not managed to stop one government expansion, one corporate expansion in the tar sands in all the years we've been fighting it. And I don't see, frankly, Amy, how we're going to do that unless we have a mindset change. I think right now it's just a negotiation about how much of this toxic waste we're going to allow and dump into our waters and our air, and how much genetic damage we're going to do.
And the mind shift would be what? What do you see needs to happen?
The mind shift is that we are a species like any other, and that we will not survive unless we place our rights in tandem with the rights of the earth. And we understand that we come from the earth. Everything we have, everything we wear, everything we eat, everything we touch comes from the earth. And if we don't change our minds, if we don't change the way we see the world, if we don't stop thinking of ourselves as superior, we're not going to survive. And I see it as an evolutionary step, an evolutionary step in our human development if we could actually come to this. And I think that there's a comparison to the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, because they fought really hard for that. And people will still say, well, what did it mean? Because human rights are still being violated. Well, just because a universal value is broken doesn't mean it's not a universal value to have. And we have to add to the universal value of the right of humans, these fundamental rights of humans, the right of the earth to survive, and for us to survive together.
And I think the key issue, Amy, is actually this is a majority perspective. Most of the indigenous cultures of the world, most of the non-industrialized cultures of the world, most of the non-Western cultures of the world live in the consciousness that we are part of nature and the earth is a mother. We are fighting against dams on the Ganges. And it's a very real discourse that the Ganges is a divine mother. She has her own standing, and the government cannot block her flow. She has a right to flow free. It's a real serious discussion in India today. That's the basis of fighting the dams, not only the environmental impact in terms of displacement, all the work we've done against patenting of life, bringing back the integrity of species. And I think if you really start to connect the dots, you realize that we are at the kind of moment where we were when slavery was being abolished. People, they were crazies then who thought it was right to trade in human beings and own them as property. A few people thought it was wrong. It took a while, but we would never today imagine it's right to own other human beings. Well, property in nature, property in life forms, patents on life, privatizing water, commodity trading of carbon pollution, the emissions trading, all of that is as insane and as mad as slavery was. And we need to get out of this bondage, which has been created by a very tiny minority who have lots to gain by raping the earth and destroying the rights of people.
One last question, and we just have a minute. Your assessment as we move into the 2012 presidential election in the United States of President Obama, from Canada, from India.
I wish he would stand up for what I think is deepest in his heart, and I wish he would stop giving the other side's line to the world. We don't need him to describe or promote the compromises that he's made. We really desperately need leadership, and I just hope that he understands that that's the most important thing he can do for us all.
Vandana Shiva.
Well, you know, President Obama has often said Gandhi is his big inspiration, and Gandhi had told us the earth has enough for everyone's needs, but not for a few people's greed. When Obama came to India, instead of talking Gandhi, instead of building a common world from US to India on that Gandhian vision of everyone living well with less, he came only to seek $50 billion deals for corporations, for fighter jets, for India joining hands for the invasion of Africa, for land grab, and the so-called Green Revolution. I do wish that Obama would exercise the policies that have brought him the inspiration that brought him to power.
Vandana Shiva, Maude Barlow, thanks so much for joining us on Earth Day.
Thank you. Happy Earth Day.
Environmental leader Vandana Shiva, among her books Staying Alive, Women, Ecology and Development, and Maude Barlow, head of the Council of Canadians. Coming up, Van Jones, Tim DeChristopher, Bill McKibben. We'll be back in 30 seconds. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Washington, D.C., where more than 10,000 people gathered this past week to mobilize around the issue of climate change. While tax day Tea Party gatherings of a few hundred scattered around the country made the news, this massive gathering, Power Shift 2011, was largely ignored by the media. Among those who spoke was Van Jones. He wrote the best-selling book, The Green Collar Economy, and he served as the Green Jobs Advisor in the Obama White House in 2009. He addressed the Power Shift gathering here in D.C.
When you get your green career, don't leave anybody behind. We have something strange happening in our economy. You notice that the wealthy people have the solar panels, and the poor people have to pay the big energy bills. And people will tell you, well, that's all right. The poor people, they can't afford the solar panels, Van. You can't complain about this. It's just economics. They can't afford the solar panels. How can you complain that they don't have them? Power shift. Shift the power and shift the conversation, because the truth is that we can't afford for poor people not to have solar panels. The earth can't afford for poor people not to have solar panels. That's the truth. Shift the power. Shift the conversation. It doesn't make any sense. I love rich folks, but they tend to live in the hills where it's shady. Poor folks tend to live in the flatlands where it's hot. It's fine to have the solar panels on the rich folks' houses where it's shady. But how about we put some solar panels on the poor folks' houses where it's hot, so instead of them having to write checks to the energy company can write them some checks, and they can be able to put some food on the table and have a good life. How about that, America? Shift the power. Shift the power. You can't do anything by yourself. Your generation has to stand together. You don't know yet, but the entire planet, the children of all species, are banking on you. You are the great hope. DC is having a bipartisan failure to rescue this economy, to rescue this planet. And while they're stuck on stupid here in DC, your generation is rising. You are the biggest generation of Americans we've ever had. The last time we had a generation your size even remotely was the baby boomers. And when the baby boomers came of age, they completely transformed America. When the baby boomers hit, we had 244 years of enslavement. We had 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. And people your age, when they hit, broke the back of Jim Crow in 4 years and put us on the trajectory to have a black president. A generation your size did that for America. That's what a generation your size did for America. You have to make a decision not to wait your turn. Dr. King was 25 years old in Montgomery. The Freedom Riders were 19 and 20 years old. The founders themselves were in their 20s and in their 30s. You have to make a decision not to wait your turn. Don't let anybody tell you you're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. Tomorrow is not promised. You must be the leaders of today, generation Power Shift. You got to be the leaders today. Shift the power. Shift the power politically. And don't let anybody tell you that you should only hold one party in this town accountable. You have to be wise enough to hold both parties to high standards. Both parties. Hold this whole town accountable. Hold people, but keep them accountable, because that's how you can shift the power. And don't stop there. Don't stop there. It's not just shifting power in a political sense. we need you to shift the power in our energy system, because we have an energy system and a civilization that is powered by death. The civilization that you live in, that you were born in, is fueled by death. That's not hyperbole. Why do they call them fossil fuels? Because they're living? Or because they're dead? We take oil, a substance that has been dead for 60 million years, and we pull it out of the ground. We take coal, which has been dead for 300 million years, and we dig holes to pull it out of the ground. We pull out of the ground death, and we burn it in our engines, and we burn death in our power plants without ceremony. And then we act shocked when, having pulled death out of the ground and burned it, we act shocked when we get death from the skies in the form of global warming, and death on our oceans in the form of oil spills, and death in our children's lungs in the form of asthma and cancer. Let's stop fueling our society based on death and start using living things. Let's start using living things now. So don't let anybody divide you. I love that we have a movement of people in America now talking about liberty. Our sisters and brothers in the Tea Party. I'm glad they're talking about liberty. And we need to understand that we believe in liberty in this movement, but we're not stopping with just the first word in the Pledge of Allegiance. I love liberty. Given what's happened with my ancestors, nobody loves liberty more than I do. But the Pledge of Allegiance doesn't stop there. The Pledge of Allegiance says liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice for all. And that's what your movement is about. Liberty, yes, and justice. Justice for the immigrants. Justice for the lesbians and the gays. Justice for the African Americans. Justice for women. Justice for the rural poor. Justice for the Native Americans. Liberty and justice for all. Shift the power. Shift the power. Shift the power. Shift the power. Thank you.
That was Van Jones, former Green Job czar at the White House, author of The Green Collar Economy. Tim DeChristopher also addressed the Power Shift 2011. He's the founder of Peaceful Uprising. Tim was convicted in March of disrupting a public land auction by posing as a bidder and buying up land in one of the Bush administration's last-minute moves to sell off oil and gas exploitation rights on vast swaths of federal land. This is Tim DeChristopher.
It's probably too late for any amount of emissions reductions to prevent the collapse of our industrial civilization. And this doesn't mean that all hope is lost. This doesn't mean that there's nothing left to fight for. This means that there's more to fight for than ever. Because that collapse that we're on track for, there's a huge range of what that could look like. And that collapse could be an opportunity for us to build a better world in the ashes of this one. It could be an opportunity for mass reflection and to decide that maybe greed and competition weren't the best values to be basing our civilization off of. We are the generation that has the task of steering our civilization through the greatest period of change humanity's ever experienced in the most rapid time. And that's a huge challenge. And we're not going to meet it in a convenient way. We're not going to meet it in a way that fits into our school schedules. We're not going to meet it in a way that we can avoid sacrifices. It's going to take some real sacrifices. We've never as a movement taken a stand because we've always been deluded into thinking that we have to ultimately accept it, that we can express our opposition, but that ultimately we have to accept it. And that's not true. If we look around this room today, to these 10,000 people that are in this room, with these people just right here, without recruiting another person, we could send 30 people onto a mountaintop removal site, shut it down temporarily, cost them a lot of money, start to clog up the court systems of West Virginia, and we could send 30 people the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, every day for a year. And I don't think we would ever get to that year point Because mountaintop removal would end before that. Long before we got to the end of that year, Barack Obama would be forced into a choice between either ending the war against Appalachia or bringing in federal troops to continue it. And for all my disgust and disappointment with Barack Obama, I don't think he would bring in federal troops to defend a mountaintop removal site. I think he would end it before it got to that point. And it's our job as a movement to force him into that position. Mountaintop removal and climate change and all the other injustices that we are experiencing are not being driven solely by the coal industry, solely by lobbyists, or solely by the failure of our politicians. They're also happening because of the cowardice of the environmental movement. We hold the power right here to create our vision of a healthy and just world if we are willing to make the sacrifices to make it happen. Where's the point where our movement is going to say that stopping this injustice is more important than my career plans, is more important than my comfort and convenience? This should be that point. Now is our time to take a stand. We're done making statements. Let this be the last time that we come together just to make statements. From now on, our movement needs to take a stand.
Tim DeChristopher, founder of Peaceful Uprising. He faces up to 10 years in prison for posing as a bidder at a public land auction. He will be sentenced in June. And we end with Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org. He addressed the young climate activists Saturday night at the Power Shift 2011 conference here in D.C. His latest book is called Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet.
The science is the easy part of this. Grim, but easy. 2010 was the warmest year on record, and it was warm. We were on the phone one day with our 350 crew in Pakistan, and one of them said, "It's hot here today." And I was surprised to hear him say it, because it's usually hot in Pakistan in the summer. And he said, "No, it's really hot. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record, 129 degrees. That kind of heat melts the Arctic. That kind of heat causes drought so deep across Russia that the Kremlin stops all grain export. That kind of heat causes the flooding that still has 4 million people across Pakistan homeless tonight." But if the scientific method has worked splendidly to outline our dilemma, that's how badly the political method has worked to solve it. Think about our own country, historically the biggest source of carbon emissions. Last summer, the Senate refused to even take a vote on the tepid, moderate, tame climate bill that was before it. Last week, the House voted 248 to 174 to pass a resolution saying global warming wasn't real. It was one of the most embarrassing votes that Congress has ever taken. They believe that because they can amend the tax laws, they can amend the laws of nature too. But they can't. I'm awful glad a few of you went up to the visitors gallery to talk some sense to them last week. Even the White House, 2 weeks ago, the Interior Secretary who spoke here 2 years ago, Ken Salazar, signed a piece of paper opening 750 million tons of coal under federal land in Wyoming to mining. That's like opening 300 new coal-fired power plants and running them for a year. That's a disgrace. You know what? At Copenhagen, we got 117 nations to sign on to that 350 target. That was good, but they were the wrong 117 nations. They were the poorest and most vulnerable nations. The most addicted nations, led by our own, weren't yet willing to bite the bullet, so that's where we've got to go to work.
Bill McKibben, author of Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet, and founder of 350.org. 350 is the parts per million many scientists say is the upper limit for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're now at 391. If you'd like a copy of today's Earth Day special, you can go to our website at DemocracyNow.org. There you can order a DVD, or you can read the transcript. You can listen to or watch the broadcast again. And tell your friends. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Shrufa Gokadus, Aaron Mate, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Nick Gilla, Hugh Grand, Jessel Noor, Jessica Lee, Ryan Devereaux, Dina Guzdar, Manal Khan, and Vesta Gadars. Also, John Randolph, Karen Krug Meadows, Brenda Murad, Rockhan Penny, Kellan Innocent, Miriam Bernard, Isis Phillips, Neil Shabata, Nicole Martin. Again, our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.